Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. We have lots to talk about, lots to dig into this week in BC politics. It's never really quiet. There is always something percolating, some issue boiling over. To get into all of it with Jeff Ferrier from Framepoint Public Affairs and Allie Blades from Mass Strategies here, as always, Team Unite. We're going to jump into decrim. This week, we had a kind of a pivotal moment where BC's top police chiefs testified before a federal committee and said they are helpless to respond to calls in many areas for open drug use due to decriminalization. So someone smoking crack cocaine beside your family on a beach, you call 911, not a police issue. Smoking fentanyl in a hospital shared room with a family member, not a police issue. That's according to the chiefs. I think that landed with a bit of a thud here. They also said 50% of prescription hydromorphone they're seizing on the street is coming from BC's Safe Supply program. So that's what they said. What do we think this means for the NDP government and for decrim and for drug policy?
So decriminalization of drug use is supposed to be about compassion and saving lives. But I think what the government is learning through this is that it's a complex issue. There's unintended consequences, including real concerns about public safety and disorder, and the government has to address them. And I think what we heard from Premier Eby this week and got the clearest indication yet that he's going to pivot in the face of community worries. You know, no one should have to feel unsafe in their own neighborhood going to work in a hospital or going to school. So I expect that the government will pivot. I expect that it will not be a pivot to end decriminalization of drugs. I think it will be a pivot focused on better and more effectively addressing the unintended consequences. I think it's fair to say that government has been slower than it should have been to address these concerns. And so it needs to act swiftly and decisively to ensure that communities are safe. And at the end of the day, that the public support remains for decriminalization because it does save lives, but it can't be done in absence of also tackling those issues, important issues around public safety and disorder.
Mm-hmm. We'll come back to that, the art of the pivot here in a second, because I think you're right, Jeff, like that seems like that's looming. Allie, the testimony, what do you think it did for the NDP internally or even in the public's mind about their appetite to let the government continue this policy?
Yeah, it's definitely feeding into that pivot that Jeff's talking about, but I don't see a scenario where that pivot doesn't inevitably lead to ending decriminalization altogether. One of the interesting things that came out of this week's discussion was that it's going to result in the federal addictions minister coming to BC and talking to the government and talking to police chiefs and figuring this all out. I think in my crystal ball projection of things, mostly because we have to make sure that we understand what this all means, is that this might actually be an out for David Eby, in that he could then point to the federal government to say, like, we didn't get enough support in the province to execute this in the way that we thought we would, and point the finger to the federal government in a slow transition to moving away from this altogether. The other thing that happened this week was David Eby put his foot in his mouth by saying that the mandate to create a safe consumption area in all hospitals across the province wouldn't happen because it's not happening everywhere. I thought that was a very clueless statement. And it's an assumption that he's making in the lack of data. We've talked about this so many times that it's a lack of data that we have no idea what's happening. So I think he's going to regret that statement.
And a lack of data, too, for anything for the government to point at as a success of decriminalization so far, beyond the nebulous idea that it has reduced stigma, which it may well be true, but it's hard for the government to advance that as the main benefit when you have mayors upset about street use disorders. You have businesses upset about vandalism and overdoses in their doorways. You have nurses upset about safety in hospitals from people smoking fentanyl. And now you have police chiefs upset that their warnings that they were not going to be able to respond to these are all, kind of cresting over the government when it comes to this sort of narrative on decrim. So we all seem to kind of predict a pivot here in some way. What is the art of the pivot for the government on this?
I think that effective pivots require a frank admission of what's happening and how it's impacting people and how it's real and not sugarcoating it. And at the same time, showing empathy, but backing it up with real action to address them that people will believe will address the consequences. We've seen it work. Skilled politicians do this all the time. I think it's unfortunate that governments see pivoting as a sign of weakness. A couple recent examples, Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, big scandal around preferential treatment for developers around development of a green belt around Toronto, an environmentally protected area. After a lot of controversy, the Premier stood up on a podium, said, this was wrong, we got it wrong, and we're not going to do that anymore. And he went from looking like he was going to lose the election to now coasting to what looks like another election victory. And we saw it here in British Columbia around the Royal BC Museum. I think we talked for weeks and weeks and weeks on this show about the optics of a huge investment in modernizing a museum and all sorts of issues around displays. But once the Premier of the day, John Horgan, stepped up and said, look at this, I've heard folks, they don't think this is the right way to spend money. It's the wrong direction. We're going to go in a new direction. Are we talking about the Royal BC Museum anymore? We're not. So pivots are a sign of strength and maturity in government. I think that publics like it when governments do it.
100%. I agree with you on that. The Royal BC Museum was a Horgan pivot. We haven't seen David Eby do that quite the same way, Allie. Do you, from what you've picked up of this Premier in sort of 18 months, the hesitancy from politicians often on the pivot is that it makes their enemies look like they won, that they're unwilling to allow, their political opponents to say, we told you so. We've been raising this for months and months and months. And in this case, I would say the opposition, BC United, has raised this issue pretty consistently and effectively. So do you see David Eby being able to pivot out of this if it means admitting that the opposition was right?
I don't think it's necessarily admitting that the opposition is right rather than the experiment failed. And that's how I would frame it if I were in the Premier's office. But again, going back to the federal ministers getting involved in the conversation now, which means that there can be some pointing of fingers to the feds. Like, this required a lot of money. If we really break it down, there should have been rapid response in health and treatment beds, all of the other things that are needed when it comes to treatment and recovery. And then going back to that data, that's a lot of money, and we did not get that. I think a win for the government here is to show that the Premier advocated, and if the feds don't want to come to the table, then at least he fought for it. And so I hope that we get a little bit of an indication of that from the meeting next week. Is what are we actually going in there and fighting for? Are we fighting for more money? Are we fighting for, when it comes to treatment, perhaps? Are we fighting for more police presence on the streets because of what's going on? Are we fighting for police presence in hospitals? We don't necessarily know, but that's the leadership that the government's really going to have to figure out going into this, because we, the voters, need to know.
But wouldn't picking a fight with Ottawa, and I'll stay with you, Allie, on this, isn't it sort of disingenuous in the sense that, BC promised to, do a public dashboard on the effects of decrim. They didn't do it. They promised regular updates to Health Canada. There's nothing in them. They promised, kind of a robust system of treatment to underpin this. They didn't do that. Like, BC's failures have contributed to, I think, Ottawa's statement this week from the minister saying, hey, we were told prior to decrim that the existing laws would allow police to do this. The province assured us of that. Like in some ways, the province is the one who kind of let the feds down on this, would be my hypothesis, just to throw back and see what you think of that.
Yeah, and no surprise there, right? Neither one of them are really going to take the blame. But the province has been really good to the federal government. They've stuck out with the carbon tax. And David Eby is one of the only premiers who's still fighting for the carbon tax. And so I would say that has given him some points in this conversation. Maybe like it's a stretch to kind of think about that, but they have a good relationship and that counts for something.
Two quick points. One is on that court case, and the folks who are fighting the laws that are preventing open drug use in public places. It's based on this twisted logic that people will die without the ability to use drugs openly, or outside schools and in parks and in business doorways. It's patently ridiculous. It's stupider than camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake saying, "Hear those strange noises in the dark woods? Let's split up and investigate." It's a bad idea. If we're trying to save people's lives, we should do that, but not in a way that creates risk for the broader population. And I want to say why I expect Premier Eby is going to want to keep decriminalization in place. For him, it's a matter of principle. It's believing that a return to fear-based systems where people are prevented from coming forward because they're afraid of jail time. It'll make them take drugs alone in alleyways, dirty needles, resist treatment. They thought because they thought if they came forward, they get taken away in handcuffs and thrown behind bars. He's afraid, I suspect, that would give us more people who are sick with HIV, Hep C, more people overdosing. And so I think he's going to ending decrim seems like the obvious political move here to get rid of the heat. You don't want to go into the election on an issue like this. But I think for the premier, what he's signaling is for him, it's a matter of a principle, and that's why he's going to fight for it.
Mm-hmm. That isn't his answer. This is the first thing he says when he's asked is, "I don't think putting people with a medical addictions condition in jail is the humane or correct thing to do." But I guess there are other options, right? Oregon has recriminalized, but if you're arrested, you can go to treatment and your charges get dropped.
Yeah.
Like there are kind of pivots off of his potential argument too, but we don't get the sense BC is looking at those quite yet either. So, yeah. Okay, let's jump into the federal budget, which was tabled this week. Went big on housing. You may have heard a lot of those ideas before because they're basically a copy-paste post from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau off of David Eby's housing plan. Things like Canada Builds. We have BC Builds, housing infrastructure tied to quadplexes and single-family lots and transit hub density, and we've done that before. So what does it mean for BC to have a copied federal housing plan? Does that position us well? And is there anything else that stood out in the budget to any of you? Allie, the Premier has said, we're already so far advanced on our housing requirements here. We meet them all from the feds. Why don't you give us some more money, like almost like a finder's fee or extra money from provinces like Ontario that don't want to play ball on these housing requirements? Think that's a realistic or actually well-positioned kind of play by BC?
Well, it's one of our biggest problems. So of course we would bring it up. One of the things that I thought was cool about the federal budget was that there was a focus on a generation. It's actually like in the name. I think it's fairness for all generations. And so when it comes to housing, of course, that would be the biggest thing because it's impacting millennials and Gen Zers. This is a voting bloc that the Liberals do not have right now. And so that's why they're targeting them. In this, though, this wealth tax that everyone keeps talking about, is it going to work? Probably not. What I really reduce it down to is the wealth tax is the way to pay for all of the money that the Liberals have spent. And it's admitting that they put us in this position. So think of that as you will, but I think this is just another massive spend, 400 pages in this budget of just spending commitments. But going back to your housing question, there's a generational focus in there for a reason, and that's a voting bloc that they need to get back.
A voting bloc, it almost felt like Trudeau had when he got elected, all the young folks who turned out to vote for him, who now are looking at him many years later being like, boy, I'm in a bad position right now as I get older. Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, all those Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z folks, let's cut through the political smoke and mirrors, right? Soaring cost of living is the ballot question in the upcoming federal election. It's not about taxes, as the Conservatives would have you believe. It's not about blaming greedy rich folks, as the Liberals suggest. The reason why generations can't afford to live in Canada anymore is boneheaded decisions made by previous governments, Liberals and Conservatives, to stop building affordable rental housing. They did it in the 1990s. And folks like Paul Martin and Stephen Harper are lionized for bringing our finances under control and making Canada a great place with the fiscal house in order. But to the Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z, you're the ones who are paying the price now. The very people that we're talking about this budget going after, the everyday people struggling to make ends meet in this housing crisis, you're paying for those decisions, stopping building affordable rental housing. Like, why would workers need affordable rental housing for a society to succeed? You're the ones who are getting squeezed out of decent homes, and it's because of idiotic decisions made by politicians more concerned with pleasing bond raters than looking out for regular Canadians. So I'm not impressed by the federal government copying David Eby. David Eby is only having to do all the things that he's having to do because the federal government for 30 years has dropped the ball and failed to live up to its duty to Canadians to make sure that we could all live here and work here and raise our families. And I'm glad that Eby's doing what he's doing on housing. I'm glad that the provinces, and particularly BC, are showing some leadership, but I'm not going to let Justin Trudeau or anyone else take a victory lap on reaching out to Gen X, Y, and Z when it's the decisions of federal governments over 30 years that has put us in the spot that we're in, where we're getting screwed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, hey, well said. Good points there. Now for something a little bit different. Here's a preview of my conversation, one-on-one interview with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. You can find the full interview on CHEKnews.ca or on the CHEK Plus app, which is free, by the way, and an archive of all our past shows. Have a watch. We have a decriminalization debate going on in British Columbia, and we have police chiefs go to a federal committee this week testify saying there's very little they can do when someone is smoking crack cocaine on a beach beside a family because of decriminalization. So I wonder if that concerns you. And also Pierre Poilievre on the show just a couple days ago saying time to end decriminalization. Do you agree with that, and what should we be doing there?
Well, we have taken a science-based, compassionate public safety approach on the opioid crisis, on the toxic drug supply crisis across the country. BC came forward a few years ago and said, we want to do a decriminalization pilot. And we said, okay, we'll work with you on that. And we continue to be there to support them as they try and figure out how to make it work. I think it's important to try and look at how we can solve this challenge, because challenges, the solutions taken in the past haven't been as effective as we've wanted to. They've gotten worse. So we were happy to support BC in doing this. But yeah, there are real challenges, and we're going to continue to be there to work with them and to help them try and solve it.
Do you feel like maybe we've gone too far, too fast on decrim and safe supply for the general public?
Too far, too fast. I think the fact is we needed to be ambitious in trying to solve this. It's not just people in downtown East Side or tent encampments that are dying of toxic drugs. It's people in the suburbs. It's middle-class families. There is a huge challenge out there, and our ability to save lives, our ability to use science and harm reduction and safe consumption as ways of trying to get through this is, I think, the right path. I mean, you're going to have people that just, like Mr. Poilievre, just throw up his hand and say, lock them up. But unless you're going at, better social supports, better housing supports, better addiction treatment, culturally sensitive approaches, things that are actually wraparound, while at the same time investing in the policing and the public safety that's necessary, you're not going to solve this. And that's the approach we're taking.
Thank you to the panel for being here, and thank you all for watching and listening. Make sure you subscribe for all the latest, and we'll be back next week with whatever is happening in the wild world of BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.